Hello. So far, we have gone through how to create a kick drum by layering multiple samples, tuning them, checking the phase between them, filtering them, and using the envelopes, attack, decay, and sustain and release in order to change how they come in and how they exit the sound. Now we're going to look at how to process them. Now, processing is something that we do in order to change the tonality and potentially even the thickness of the sound when it comes to a kick drum. Now, when processing a kick drum, there's tons of things that you could actually do, but we're going to focus on using EQs, compressors, and potentially some saturation in order to potentially make the kick a bit more transient focused, softer, boomier, or brighter. And I'm going to show you how to achieve all those different variations. Let's start with a compressor. Now here's what the kick sounds like at the moment. And the first thing we're going to do is load in a compressor. Now we're just going to use the compressor that comes with Ableton. Now keep in mind, I'm going to place the compressor over here. The reason for this is because of the way Ableton works in terms of hierarchy. So we've got a drum rack where we can place multiple sounds or samples. Now, what we've done is we've taken these three and we have created a kick group. Now let me dissolve the group and then I'll do it again just so that you can see what the process is. Here are the three individual kick sounds. Now, what I want to do is group them together so that I can add effects and processing that will affect all three kicks simultaneously. The way we do this is by highlighting all three in the chain. Make sure you've got your chain showing up from here if you can't see it. Right click and select group. Now all these three kicks have been placed into this drum rack group and I can rename this to kick group. Now you see these slots over here. Focus to where the mouse is. If I add effects here, the effect will process all three kicks simultaneously. If I add an effect, however, here, it will only process the individual kick that we have highlighted. So if I add the compressor here, right now we've got the kick future highlighted, and I highlight kick 90s 1, the compressor disappears because it's not processing kick 90s 1. If, however, I move the compressor over here, that's essentially the output of all three kicks. So no matter which kick I have highlighted, we can still see the compressor. It's processing all three kicks simultaneously. So the signal flows from the kick channel to here and then to the right. It kind of goes left to right. So if we added effects here, such as this EQ that we were using to show what's going on with some frequencies, and this scope analyzer as well, this will process the entire drum rack. So if we had any hi-hats or snare drums and we added effects over here, it would process all of them. Okay, so we don't want to do that. We only want to add effects that will be processed by the kicks in case we add more sounds such as snares and hi-hats here later on. So just to make this simple and clean, I'm going to delete the EQ. We don't need it. I'm going to keep the scope actually because we might do it, but I'm going to minimize it. Just one more time. If you add effects here, it's going to process the individual sound you have highlighted. If you add them here, that's going to process all of the sounds in the group. And if you add effects here, it's going to process every single sound in your drum rack. Okay? On to how to actually process the kick drum and make it sound really, really good. So like I mentioned before, the first thing I'm going to use is a compressor. Now with a compressor, there is a lot that you can do. Let me give you the basics of what a compressor actually does. A compressor simply reduces the volume level of a signal or a sound that crosses the threshold. Let me repeat that. It reduces the volume level of a sound that crosses a threshold or that reaches beyond the threshold. So with this compressor, here is our threshold control. If I start turning this down and take it to the point below the signal, I'm going to turn this off for now. I'll explain what it does later. So if I turn it to below where the kick drum signal reaches, the kick will begin to lower in volume. The GR stands for gain reduction. And on this view, you can actually see this curve, this line represents the reduction in volume to the kick drum. If I raise the threshold, that gain reduction reduces. No gain reduction with the threshold above the signal of the kick. A lot of gain reduction with the threshold below the signal of the kick. Now, what if we applied compression but told the compressor to not react to the sound immediately? That means that it would bypass the first few milliseconds of the sound and compress the rest of it, therefore resulting in a clickier kick, like this. Listen to this compared to that. This is much clickier because it's bypassing, not compressing the very first few milliseconds of the kick, and then it begins compression. Now, this is determined by the attack. That's what the attack control does. If I open up the little info view to the left, we'll show you if I hover over it. Sets how long it takes to reach maximum compression once the signal exceeds the threshold. So if we've got it at 25, 30 milliseconds, the compressor will take 30 milliseconds in order for it to begin compressing at its full compression ratio. Now, the release is kind of the same, but the opposite. So once the signal goes back below the threshold, so here's the kick signal. You see that the kick doesn't stay at full volume constantly, kind of lowers a little bit towards the end. So once it lowers back down, does compression stop immediately or does it stop gradually? So what I want to do is I want to kind of show you with a waveform what it actually does. So I've dragged in a kick as an audio file. What I'm going to do is I'm going to visually demonstrate what a compressor does. Now I'm going to place the compressor on the track and I'm going to apply compression with an attack time of 30 milliseconds. And a quick release time as well. And then I'm going to essentially bounce this in place by freezing and flattening. And I want you to look at the difference in the waveform in the signal level, the amplitude, before and after. So here it is before, here it is after, before, after. Let me apply a bit more compression so you can see even more of a difference. So I can increase the attack time even more. Apply even more compression. And make up the gain a little. Okay. So I want you to notice what happened here and here. Now, the beginning of the kick remained uncompressed. So you can see where the amplitude of this wave reaches. It reaches the top. This one reaches the top as well. But around here, the compression begins. So on this third kind of wave, the cycle, it reaches the top originally, and with compression applied, it's lowered in volume a bit. Same with this, lowered in volume a bit. However, here, over here, the compression stops. You can see that with without the compressor, it reaches this point, and with a compressor, basically the same point. The reason for that is because at this point, the kick went back lower than the threshold level. And because the release was set to immediate 1 millisecond, the compression stopped immediately, very abruptly. So basically the attack time made the compressor bypass the first 50 milliseconds, so around this part. Then it began compressing. And then the compression reset around here. So if I show you via automation, it kind of did this. Original volume, started compressing, compressed around here, and then it reset around here. That is essentially what it did. Now, if I increase the release time, I'm actually going to need to unfreeze the track. If I increase the release time to, let's go quite high actually. Yeah, that'll work. And delete the volume automation as well. And then I freeze and flatten. You see how now the whole sound from this point onwards has been compressed before, after. Because with a release time this high, even if the kick drum signal goes back down below the threshold, the compressor is going to take this long to stop reducing the volume level. That's what the release time does. So the attack and the release times can determine the way a compressor responds and therefore drastically change the way a sound sounds. How clicky it is versus how boomy or punchy it is. For example, if we compressed the beginning of the kick and didn't compress the end of the kick would sound less clicky and more boomy because the sub-fundamental of the kick usually lasts longer than the clicky part of the kick. So going back to our kick, I'm going to delete this. Using a compressor, which we've inserted on the kick group so that all three kicks are processed by it, what we can do is quite drastically change the way the kick responds. So if I apply compression with an immediate attack and a quick release, and I apply quite heavy compression, I'll also insert a look ahead, which means the compressor looks ahead and begins compressing either 1 or 10 milliseconds before the kick begins. That way it really compresses the beginning of the kick. We'll go with 1 millisecond. Then the kick can sound a lot less clicky and more boomy. Have a listen. With, without. One more time. Let's go with 10 milliseconds as well. With, without. See, we've still got the same, roughly the same amount of boominess or sub volume, but the clicky part of the kick has been reduced. And that means the transient, the beginning of the kick, the high frequencies. Now we can take this a step further. If I open this up and I activate the EQ and I turn this up with a high pass filter selected, now the compressor is only going to be listening to the high frequencies of the kick drum. This means that it's basically applied a filter to its input signal, and it's only going to respond to the high frequencies of the kick. We're still going to hear the whole kick, but that's what the compressor is going to be listening on. So then we can more accurately compress the high frequencies and leave the sub of the kick alone. Listen to this. We're able to pretty much completely take away the transient of the kick drum and leave the sub alone. Without, with. So a compressor is really quite a dynamic tool that you can use to shape your sounds. Now here's what we're going to do. We're going to use fairly low ratio. I'm going to up the attack a little because I want the transient to be quite present in this kick. we're going to have a fairly quick release time. So it's going to compress the middle part of the kick a little bit. So that would be leaving the beginning alone, compressing the middle part, and kind of bringing back up the sustain, the end tail of the kick, just to make the kick feel a little bit longer, a bit more transient focused, and the sub of the kick being a bit more powerful. A small amount. There you go, very cool. Now, just to also explain what the ratio does. The ratio determines how much compression is applied above the threshold. So let's go something simple. A 2-to-1 ratio means for every 2 decibels that the signal goes above the threshold, 1 is taken away. So 2-to-1 means if you're 2 decibels above the threshold, only 1 decibel will be allowed through, and so on. So by the same token, if 10 decibels go above the threshold, 5 decibels will be taken out. Only 5 will be allowed through. 3-to-1 ratio is obviously higher compression. Usually between 2-to-1 and 3-to-1, it's known as fairly mild compression. When you get to 4-to-1 ratio and above, it's known as quite heavy compression. And anything from sort of 10 decibels onwards, it's almost brick wall limiting, which basically means the signal is going to stay where the threshold is. It's not going to be allowed to be any louder than the threshold. We're going to go with around 3-to-1 for this purpose. Okay. Now the next thing we're going to add in order for us to process the kick is an equalizer. EQ8 after the compressor. And we can shape the kick by boosting or attenuating individual frequencies or frequency segments of the whole kick drum. So if we want a bit less low end, we can reduce the sub 100 hertz. If we want more clickiness, we can increase the high frequencies. If we want less, we can reduce them. Usually a good rule of thumb is high pass. So I'm going to add a high pass filter and get rid of everything below about 30 hertz. I'm going to go with a 4-pole, so it's a steep high pass. Everything below, let's go 27 hertz. That's going to make sure there's no really low subharmonic frequencies present, which may make your whole mix and kick more muddy. Sound a bit tighter, basically. Then I'm going to reduce frequencies around 150 because they can sound quite muddy. Just a little bit. About 2.5 decibels. It's those frequencies here. We can open up the kick a little bit more. Now, I don't really want to touch anything more on the EQ. You could do, like I said, if you wanted it to be brighter or softer. You could also turn up 1 kilohertz. A lot of rock musicians do this because it's quite a sort of rocky mid-range frequency. We'll turn it down. But I'm not going to do that. The next thing we can add is something known as saturation. We've got a saturator here. There's quite a few. We've got overdrive, we've got saturator, and we've even got the drum bass, which also has saturation. We're just going to go with the saturator. This can distort, in a sense, the kick drum a little bit. So be very careful how you apply this and how much you apply it. I'm going to turn down the output because it can increase the volume level quite significantly. So I'm turning it down so that when I apply more drive, the volume level doesn't hurt our ears or break the speakers. There you go. And you've got different types of saturation. Analog clip, soft sine. There you go. That's very, very heavy saturation. You can clearly hear the result. So if you want something like a very heavy kick, you could add the saturator, increase the drive, go to the hard clipping curve and lower the output. And you've got a very heavy kick drum. I'm going to go with soft. And just apply a little bit like that. Now be careful with these. These can determine essentially where the saturation is applied. So you can filter the saturation that you have applied with this. And here you can determine whether the saturator will affect more the low or the high frequencies. So for example, if I increase this, it's going to increase the amount of saturation applied on the low frequencies. If I reduce it, it will reduce the amount of saturation applied on the low frequencies, which can sometimes sound a bit messy, but keep the saturation applied on the higher frequencies. To me, that sounds a little bit cleaner. Now, a lot of the time to get the very best sound, it's not just down to the plugins you use, but it's also down to the actual samples that you've chosen. And even though we've gone through everything you need to do in order to get a really tight sounding kick, I feel like there's a couple things we can still adjust on the samples to really perfect the sound. I'm going to solo each one to hear which one I feel is causing the problem. This one, I feel like this can be shorter because it's kind of conflicting with the subharmonic kick. So I'm going to bring the end tail back a bit, increase the fade out. To me, that sounds better. Okay. I also feel like the sub here can be a little bit lower in volume. Probably because we've also raised it due to the compressor. So there's two ways I could do this. I could increase the release on the compressor, or I can reduce the volume of the actual sample, which is probably what I'm going to do. I'll do it from here. There you go. Fantastic. Another thing we could do is make this shorter if we wanted to. Right now it's about 200 milliseconds. Bring it back a bit. So if you're not making music that needs a very heavy sub on the kick, shorten the sub. Simple. Now there is more things we could do with the kick drum. We could apply parallel processing. So we could have a second chain of a kick, or we could sort of send the signal of the kick to a second chain, and then we could apply some heavy distortion and saturation, and this is known as parallel processing. I tend not to do that very much because I feel like the second chain can conflict and phase with the first chain and make it sound quite unstable. But I'm going to show you it anyway, just because a lot of producers love using parallel processing and it's good for you to know. Now there's quite an easy way to use parallel processing in Ableton. What you need to do is use effects racks. Now the way we do this is I can highlight these three effects, which are the original effects on the original kick group. I can right click and I can select group. And an audio effects rack has been created, and I can see that when I click on the chain list over here. Now this chain is essentially just the effects chain that we created on the kick group, and that's how the signal is currently flowing. It's going from the kick to these effects, and then to the right to the master group effects from the drum rack, and then out to the output into the master channel. Now if I right click here and I select create chain, I can have a second chain of effects with different processing applied, and then I can get the kick to be processed by both of these simultaneously. So this can be original, and this can be parallel, just like that. Now for example, I could apply a saturator, really heavily distort it with that hard curve. I'm going to turn down the output because it will be extremely loud. Turn down the volume here as well. And then I can make sure, that it's going through both chains. So we've got this chain and this one combining at the output, just like this. Now, This is also quite important, the chain list here, which I'll show you in a second, but this is how we can do it. So the parallel has the heavy saturation, the original has the original kick sound. Now, the one downside to this is you can't get them acting in serial configuration. So we can't, for example, go from the original to the parallel, which means if we want the output of this chain to go into the second chain, the only way to do this is to create a effects rack after this one. Now let me demonstrate that. So if I can just drag and drop this to the right of this effects rack, and you'll see that now we have two. We've got the original, this one, and to the right of this, we've got a second effects rack. Now what we need to do is have two chains. We'll have one called dry, which means we've got no processing applied here. It's just the signal as it comes out from the previous effects rack. One called parallel. And the parallel is the one with our additional plugins added to it. So just to make sure you understand this, signal flows from the group, the kick group, into the audio effects rack, where we've got a compressor, an EQ, and a saturator. Out of this effects rack into a second effects rack where we've got two parallel chains. One of them has no effects, so it's just whatever the kick was like before. One of them has the heavy saturation applied, and they're running simultaneously and combining at the output. Now, one more thing I want to mention about effects racks, which is extremely powerful, is the chain over here. I can hide it and I can activate it. Now, right here, I can move this sort of slider, and this is for the following purpose. Now, each chain has a little block associated with it. It can be expanded like this, and then it can be moved around. Now, if you had this above the dry block here, that means that you're only going to be hearing the output of the dry chain. So no matter what you've added in the parallel effects chain, you're not going to hear it. If you had this over the parallel block, or the zone, sorry, as Ableton calls it, you're only going to hear the parallel chain. Now, if you had it over both, you're going to hear both chains in parallel, simultaneously, and equally, unless you've adjusted the volume levels over here. Now, you can also have a fade out and a fade in. And then you could automate this to be moving from one chain to another. Now, if you don't know what automation is, we'll talk about it in a later video, but you could be going from one chain to another and kind of fading out of one and fading into the other. Here the result, if I do it manually with a mouse. Dry, bit distorted, and then fully distorted. It's a very, very powerful tool. Think about the possibilities if you had multiple chains. Now you've got 3 zones which you can move around and be as creative as you want. Now, when you have a chain of effects that you like and you use often, save it. Name it whatever you want to name it and save it, so that in the future all you've got to do is load it up by dragging it and dropping it, and you'll have the exact same chain with the exact same effects and settings. You can also right click and favorite or assign a color to anything you want. So if I assign this to green, then on green I can see it straight away. Then I could just load it immediately. Super easy. Okay. Now, one more thing I want to talk about regarding macros. You don't want to be clicking and moving this manually, but anything that can essentially be moved, well, most things that can be moved in Ableton can be assigned to a macro. So if I right click on this and I select map to macro 1, I can now move it by moving the chain selector macro 1. This could also be assigned to a control or a knob on a MIDI controller or a MIDI keyboard, and then you could move that with your hand and this would move at the same time. Now obviously from left to right it goes all the way and it passes the actual zones, but we can prevent that from happening. If I activate mapping mode, which you do from here, you can always see it on the effects rack. If I click on this, the left side of Ableton turns into my settings for the macros. So where it says min and max, this sets the range of the macro over here. So the second zone only goes up to 40. So if I set the maximum range to 40, like this, well, 39, now the macro will only be able to go up to 39. So there's no chance of you accidentally going beyond that and the effects rack not being active whatsoever. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Try to use it in your own productions, especially on kick drums. It can be a very powerful tool. And moving on to the next part now. See you in the next video.